Hello everybody, today I am driving the Land Rover Freelander 2, and while both this and its predecessor are cars that I've never really given much thought to, those in the know tell me it's something of a hidden gem. So today, at long last, I'm getting behind the wheel and I'm going to find out if this is a car worth your money. The original Freelander arrived back in 1997 as a new entry point into the ever-growing Land Rover catalogue. And despite the fact it was positioned as the company's most affordable and smallest entry, in 5-door guise it was in fact the same size as the original Range Rover and had a wheelbase that was actually an inch longer. As it happens, when anybody mentions the Freelander to me, it's not just the first generation I think of, but specifically the 3-door variant, which today has gone on to become something of a cult classic, one of many 3-door proper 4x4s of the time that I think are really rather cool. That car was eventually discontinued in 2005, and then, in late 2006, its successor arrived. This, the Freelander 2, known in some markets as simply the LR2. These were facelifted once in 2011 and then a second time in late 2012 or possibly 2013. This is an example of that final facelift, which was then in production until about 2014, potentially early 2015. For the benefit of those who, like myself, don't speak Land Rover, how does this fit into the lineup? Well, like its predecessor, it was positioned to be the entry point into the range. So, unlike the slightly larger Discovery, it had just the 5 seats rather than 7. It was also not meant to be anywhere near as luxurious as the Range Rover or Range Rover Sport. And at the other extreme, it wasn't designed to be quite as versatile or agricultural as the original Defender, which by this point was in its twilight years. However, this was a car still built around the core principles of a Land Rover, which to me are the fact that their cars should be big, comfy and capable. And it is for this reason that I was never in love with this car's successor, the Evoque, because that was a car, you see, that prioritized style above all else, and in that it managed to sacrifice what I think made these cars so usable. By that point, really, you should have just gone and bought a regular hatchback. My dad had an Evoque, a 3-door one, and it was honestly pitiful. My 3 Series was far more versatile because, let's be honest, the people buying Evoques didn't take them off-road, so the fact it might have been decent in the muddy stuff was essentially irrelevant. Back to the Freelander 2 though, and as this was a car developed during the time that Land Rover were owned by Ford, it's actually built on a platform shared with a great number of Volvos, a company they also owned, and even the 2nd generation Focus. Not that from here you'd really notice it. In fact, there isn't really all that much Fordy at all that I can see, barring these window switches here, which are in fact Volvo and also shared with the likes of Jaguar and Aston Martin. Up front, you'll also find a number of engines also from the Ford family. There were 2 petrols, a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel, and a straight 6-turbo taken from Volvo. But, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most popular engine choice, certainly here in Britain, was the 2.2-litre turbo diesel, branded as Duratorq. It came ultimately in 3 different flavours, a 150 horsepower, 160, and here a 190, which also made 310 pound-foot of torque, that's 420 newton meters. These were then paired with either the manual or a Toyota-derived torque converter automatic, both a 6-speed. Should you really feel the need yourself, you can actually shift the lever over and change gears on your own, though to be honest, there really isn't all that much point in doing so. It actually does a reasonable job of it. But the fact is, the engine has a fairly decent spread of torque, and this is simply not a sporty car. The overall economy is what you call okay, rather than great. As an average, Jason quoted about 30 to the gallon, and on a run it will get 35. This is sadly some way shy of the claimed 40, however, for the durability of this engine, it's a sacrifice that I think is well worth making. I have to say, when I was doing my research, not only was it quite difficult to find out certain things about this car, but I also wasn't sure whether they actually even sold a petrol to the UK market. There have been a few times in the recent past where that hasn't been the case. Discovery 4, case in point. However, with this, they did. It just seems, though, that nobody wanted to buy one, because when I looked today, there were near 200 of these cars for sale, yet just 12 of them had a petrol in them. And one of them was an erroneous listing for a sort of 10-year newer Range Rover, so I don't know what that was doing in there. In any case, I was actually delighted to see that both the 4 and 6-cylinder engine were sold here, and amazingly, not commanding a significant premium. If I were in the market for one of these, I think I'd be very, very tempted by that 6, but they are a rarity, and to get one, you might have to compromise on your specification. Provided you don't need something ULEZ compliant, for most people, I think this diesel is going to do the job. It's fine, it does the business, it suits a car like this quite well. And incidentally, it appears to be quite a versatile car, this, because the first owner was a reverend and the second was a pilot. And happily, neither of them seem to have used the car for towing anything, because when he got it, Jason saw there was no evidence a tow bar had ever been fitted, which is something certainly to look out for with cars like this. I in fact know of at least one car out there where, when it was purchased, an underside inspection was done and they found that though the front was absolutely fine, the rear was falling apart, and the people who bought it suspected whoever had it before might have owned a boat. Curiously enough, one of the things that makes this car so appealing, according to its owner Jason, are the things it doesn't have. So, for example, this car does not have air ride suspension, instead sitting on conventional coils and springs. Let's test the turning circle. In a 4x4 I really expect it to be good, but it's okay. It's not great. Visibility though is, and though this B-pillar is a little further forward than I'd like it, honestly, it's not an issue. You can see so well in this thing, it's spectacular. I also appreciate the twin roofs, and it does feel like a pretty decent place to spend your time. And I have to say, I am generally quite impressed with the interior of this thing. I was worried it just wouldn't be good enough, and that's one of the reasons I've never really even considered a Freelander. The reason for that is that one of the last Land Rovers I drove was the Discovery 4, a contemporary of this, but a car that sat above it. And that inside, well, it just felt a bit cheap and nasty. Now, granted, that was a farm hack and not a top spec model. This is the HSE Luxe, which is one of the higher trims that you could get, and so is appointed with plenty of leather. Here, a beautiful sort of beige. Though by modern standards, the car isn't exactly overflowing with tech, you've also got just about everything you need. The infotainment system up here actually still feels relatively up to date and would have been the current setup of the day. You've also got a Meridian stereo, and you also seem to have nearly the same controls that you'd get in a Disco 4, which are a bit silly, big and chunky, but I know there's a logic behind it, and the steering wheel also feels the same. But you know what, overall it feels okay, this thing. You have heated seats, though not ventilated, dual zone climate control, and it's all pretty decent, I would say. And should you be using this all year round, which of course you would, you've also got the Ford favourite, the heated front screen, which I've never been a fan of because I wind up sort of staring at the wiggly lines, but I will admit, when it's really cold, is quite nice to have. Ticking off one of my requirements for a Land Rover, it's a decent size. Unlike the Evoque, this is still a proper 4 or 5 seater car with a decent sized boot. And in fact, actually, it's maybe the boot that I hated most about the Evoque, because it was honestly pathetic. And to me, if you're going to buy a Land Rover, surely part of the reason is you want to chuck a lot of stuff in it, be it either people, their things, or a combination of both. The Evoque couldn't do that, and that's particularly impressive when you consider in terms of exterior dimensions it's only about 4.5 meters long, so similar, say, to a Jeep Grand Cherokee, yet it feels easily a class bigger in here. Land Rover got this one, I would say, just about right. Comfort then, I think we can also fairly safely tick off. Not only is the ride quality decent, but the seats are pretty nice too. They don't support you in the corners all that much, but honestly, it's a Land Rover. I don't really expect that. I do, however, appreciate these adjustable armrests, which you get on both of the front seats. You've got this lovely view out, including plenty of that bonnet. And that is one reason that this car was bought. It was purchased for Jason's partner, and she wanted something that was big, but she could see out of and place easily. This is a real Land Rover strength. Until you've driven both a Land or Range Rover and one of their competitors, you don't really appreciate just how much of a difference the styling of a car makes. You see, a while back I got out of a then current Range Rover, the full fat big one, and into an F-Pace, which in theory is a class smaller because it's based on the Velar. However, the F-Pace was far trickier and scarier to drive. Because of the way it was styled, you didn't know where the bonnet was, and therefore you couldn't really place the car all that easily, meaning it felt much bigger than it was. Curious and maybe irrelevant to some, but not to me. When you're driving little roads like this, it's important. Being able to put your car where you need it, especially if you're going to buy a big one, is key. And finally, is this car capable? Well, I'm not going to be taking it off-road today. However, I can tell you it's still a four-wheel drive, though not in the sense of your classic Range Rovers. It instead employs a Haldex system, so I expect most of the time, particularly on road, it is in fact front-wheel drive. But as and when required, it can deploy the rear wheels too, and this car also has the classic Land Rover terrain selector down here. I call it classic. I think this car might actually have debuted it, and in essence it gives you a few little pictures that you can choose to tell the car exactly what kind of surface you're on, and it will then act accordingly. It's a good system, and by all accounts, should you need it to, this car will perform off-road, which is nice. On the black stuff, where I expect most of these are going to spend their time, it's still a fairly pleasant experience. When you get to town speeds, the ride does take on a slight edge of jitter, but nothing really to complain about, and in all fairness, I think still better than some of the regular second-gen Focus on which this is sort of vaguely based. The weighting of the steering is nice, another classic Land Rover hallmark, and although today this roughly 2-ton car is struggling a little bit in the corners, that is simply physics in action, not a failing of the car. It communicates its ability level nicely, clearly, and I'm never in any doubt of whether I am or am not going to get round a bend. It is a thoroughly nice thing to be in. It doesn't egg you on, but neither should it, and Jason tells me whenever he goes on a long trip and he offers his children the choice of either this or his Mercedes AMG E53 convertible, it's always the Freelander they want to go in. And honestly, I can't blame them. You're up nice and high, so you've got good visibility, you've got the pair of sunroofs, and honestly, with the roof up, the AMG is going to feel considerably more claustrophobic. You're also then, say on the NC500, never going to be worried if you've got to bump a car up a curb or do a mild bit of off-roading. If you've got to get through a little bit of floodwater, this is going to be fine. No, I wouldn't exactly take it through Rufford Ford, but still, in the vast majority of scenarios, I can imagine this is going to get you where you need to go when you need to go there. Particularly impressive because these are not cars that you're going to have to pay all that much to buy. Prices start at around £2,000, with the very latest and lowest mileage going for up to about 20. However, in the middle, you've got a great selection of high specification cars like this for around £8,000 to £10,000. And for that, it's a lot of car. More than that though, it's also an example of a car you should be able to run on a fairly modest budget. I mentioned earlier, one of the things that Jason loves about this are some of the things it doesn't have. And in that list, you're also going to find the engine. Yes, of course, it's still got one, but here it's a Ford, not a Land Rover one. And this is significant because the later Land Rover 4 and also the 6 fitted to the Discovery that I drove have a reputation for fragility that is rather worrying. My sister had a Disco Sport and that suffered a catastrophic engine failure which cost her about £8,500 to fix, and it's sadly not a rare occurrence. I don't know how it was that they managed it, but these things are notorious. This Ford unit though is pretty darn reliable, and well treated, both it and the gearbox should go on for quite some time. Now the cars of course aren't impervious to issues, but the ones they suffer seem to be minor, like for example the central brake light at the back does like to crack and then fill with water. It's an annoyance. I'm also told, and this is common for all JLR products, that parts availability can be something of an issue. In the 6 years and 50-odd thousand miles that Jason has had this car, it has never left him stranded, and the vast majority of years, all he's had to pay out for is regular maintenance. The car has never even needed work to get it through an MOT, and the biggest bill faced thus far was one that was fairly recent, which totaled around £2,000. However, that included not just the EGR work, but also a fairly major service. And for a car which is now celebrating its 10th birthday and on 100,000 miles, I think it's actually not all that bad. And so there we have it. I'm sure I've missed a few things out, and so if you know that I have, please hop into the comment section down below and share it with the rest of the class. But as far as I'm concerned, this has been a real education already. Up until now, I'd never even considered a Freelander. I'd always thought of it as the weird little sort of 3-door Rover-powered thing from 25 years ago that had already rusted 10 years ago, and so was not a car to even give a second thought. Now though, having driven this, it's actually a car that if someone came to me and said, James, I want to buy a 4x4, I've got £10,000, and if it could be a Land Rover, that'd be nice, what do I get? Actually, I think I'm going to point them the way of the Freelander. It's got the qualities I want of a Land Rover and doesn't seem like it's going to be all that ruinous to run. So, all that remains to be said is a big thank you to Jason for lending it to me, and as ever, to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you for the next one. Bye bye.